Welcome everybody, it's Paul Rowe here from Vernon Systems. Today's webinar is going to be covering system maintenance, and we're going to be looking at a variety of different topics in the system to help keep the system up to date and to clean up things as you go along. So the first topic that I want to look at is the audit tool within Vernon. Every time you make a change within the system, a copy of that record is kept in the audit log. So you can go back and review past changes. You can undo changes by rolling back to a previous version of a record. And you can also use that audit log to reinstate things like deleted records. However, over time, that log does build to be quite a large set of data, and you can periodically choose to purge some of that information. So that's what we'll look at first. We can choose to do a transaction report, which will just show us a summary of the records changed within any period or criteria that I'm looking at. So on the Tools menu, we can go to System Maintenance, Audit, Transaction Report. And then I was filling in just the to date field. If I click on Go, it's going to find all of the audit transactions that fall within that particular period or selection criteria. And so we can see there's a number of different records that have been changed. Records in the photo file. Quite a few pages of those. Changes to Vernon browser settings, classification file, and so on. And it's just giving us the ID of the record and the one-line summary of it, plus the date and time. So we can see some of those transactions date back a long way. And so at the moment, we've got years worth of data in their audit log, and we might decide to clear some of the oldest entries in that. If I wanted to clear that, it's just a case of using exactly the same tool to select what I'm interested in clearing, and then clicking on the Purge Afterwards checkbox. So most of our sites would keep at least a month's worth of data in the audit log, but often longer than that. 3 months or a year is also quite common because it can be very useful to review past copies of records and understand who changed something and why they changed it at a particular date. I won't clear that in this case because I am wanting to keep the audit log in my example system. But I could refine that criteria using any of these options. So I could only clear the things that are specific to a particular file. By default, Vernon never clears deleted records unless you override the settings for the audit tool. In other words, if you delete a record, it's permanently in the audit log and you can restore that at a later date. So those settings for things like whether deleted records are retained is also on that same audit menu. So that's under Audit Configuration. And at the moment, it's not set to allow deleted transactions to be purged, but I could change that. The other thing which you will encounter is if the audit log grows very large, then you'll get a warning message at login to tell you that the number of entries in that log has gone beyond a certain limit. You can actually tailor that limit just for your own site. By default, it's set at 1,000 records, but many sites have increased that. So our larger sites would often keep hundreds of thousands of records in the audit log. And it's just a compromise as to how quickly you can run reports on the audit log, and also how much disk space those logs are taking up. So if you're finding that messages popping up frequently and annoying you, then you can come to this screen and set this warning message level to be a higher number of records. For most organizations, a reasonable limit would be 5,000 to 10,000 terms, so that you are being prompted if it's getting to be years of things in there. But for very active organizations, that's just too low, and you'll be prompted every week because it's reached that limit again. So we do have sites which have set that to numbers in the kind of 100 to 200,000 range, and it just means it's using up more data on their server. And when you run an audit log, it's got a longer log to look through when it's producing whatever report you've asked for. So there's just a trade-off there between how active your site is and how quickly you want audit to work and how much space you're willing to use up on the server. We'd be happy to look at an individual site and based on your size and activity, give you a recommendation. And so, as I mentioned, we can use that audit log to review changes that have been made and optionally undo those changes. So I've currently got open one of the prints within my collection, and I might be interested in seeing what older versions of that record Vernon currently holds in the audit log. I can go to the Edit menu, and the Rollback Record screen will show me previous versions. So if I click on that, if I roll back to the previous version of that record, I would be deleting a link to a condition report with the ID number 8. And each time I go back to previous versions, I'm gradually undoing more and more changes on that record. So we can see that way back in February 2017 was when I added a description. And so going back through those records would be undoing these changes. And just clicking on OK would actually take that into effect. So we go back to that old version. We can do the same thing for a whole group of records as well. An example would be if somebody did a bulk update in the system, but accidentally selected the wrong records or had some kind of typo perhaps in the information they've added in bulk. The easiest way to address that might be to undo all of those changes through the audit log. So again, we can go to System Maintenance, Audit, and we can use any of these options, Transaction Report, Change Data Report, to look at changes made in a certain set of dates or to a particular set of files. And then if we wish, we could roll back those changes. So the Change Data Report, the difference is that it shows me what changed rather than just telling me the list of records and who updated them. So I can see all the records that have been changed since 1st of August last month, for example. And that's going to be a much smaller number of records. So we can see there was a condition report added, which was condition report 8, which we saw linked a minute ago. An exhibition, and then some sundry changes to objects, mostly adding links to that bulk condition report that was created. If I decided that all those changes had been made in error, then there's an option on that audit menu to undo the changes. And so that's the recovery undo option. Recovery redo would only be used if you were restoring from backup. So if you had, for instance, a hard disk error on the server where one of the folders within Vernon was corrupted, you can potentially restore that folder from backup and then use the audit log to reapply changes since the backup was done. So at best, the backup's probably going to be nightly. You might be able to use the audit log to apply all the changes from last night up until midday today so that you don't lose any of that. But in this case, I'm doing the undo option, and I'm going to undo those changes that I saw from 1st of August. So by default, it'll just give me a report, which is the same report we were looking at before, but I'm going to untick that and click on Go. It's then just going to cycle through that audit log and tell me as it makes each of those changes going back to the previous version. One of those records is already open on my screen, so Vernon can't change that record while I'm already working on it somewhere else in the system. And so that's something I'd have to go back to later. In this case, go back to that Pacific Hero print and undo the changes on that one record. So that's the key things that are possible within the audit file. The next thing that we'll look at is looking at how we can improve system performance. So there's a few different areas of the system where it's doing updates in the background, where you can clear things that the system's been working on to streamline things in the future. The first of those is the movement log. Every time the system records an update to a location, it logs that, and it's a file that you can report on. And so that's just available from the reporting screen under movement log. And that just lets you do basic listings, for example, to show what are all the objects that moved from an old location to a new location. And maybe the move date might be interesting as well. So if I preview that report, there's going to be lots of moves over time. So again, like the audit file, that's useful as a tool for just reviewing moves that have been done over a period. You might have to do statistics for a management report to say, well, how many objects got moved to a new location in a particular period, and the movement log can help you do that. But again, it builds up over time and becomes a large set of extra data. So this is in addition to the location history that's permanently stored on each object record. We can choose to clear the movement log, and you'll still have that history retained forever on each individual object record. You just won't be able to run this movement log on changes that happened in that period. So that's held in the system in the tools menu, and again in system maintenance, there's just an option to clear the movement log. So unlike the audit tool, it's just a simple option to clear that file whenever you're ready. If you're wanting to retain the information in it, the only option would be to run a report and then just save the results of that report as a reference for yourself. We have some sites that don't make use of the movement log at all, in which case it might be just part of your regular maintenance on the system, as once a month or once a year to jump into that log and clear it out. Like the audit tool, you can set a warning for when that log file is growing large, and that's in the customized configuration that you have the option of changing the number of entries in the movement log at which the system warns you. And so that's similar to the setting we saw for audit before. If there's more than 1,000 entries in the movement log, the supervisors will be getting a warning. In addition to the audit file, it's also essential that you're doing backups of the system itself. So the system's keeping changes in its own audit log, but there's the potential for bigger disasters. So things like server failures where a hard disk has been corrupted, something like that, Vernon's not able to recover from it because it's a lower level hardware issue. So it's essential that you're keeping your own backups of the system. The help for the system is fully online, so I'll just open up the Vernon CMS help. So this is something you can do a search on in Google to get to the Vernon help, or just go to vcms-help vernonsystems.com. And so this is the help of every different function in the system, right down to field level. And one of the topics is about backing up the system. And so that gives our guidance on how you should be doing that. As a minimum, you should be backing up the system as frequently as you're changing it. So if you're actively changing data every day, you really want to be backing that up every day. And you want to be testing those backups. So actually restoring periodically a copy of the system to a test location and checking you can log into it and use it. So we have had cases of clients that have run into some kind of disaster, and only at that point have they realized there was a fault in their backup process where Vernon wasn't being backed up correctly, and then they've got no option for restoration. So that's the worst possible scenario. In addition to the online help, we also have our customer support portal, and that's where you can access things like upgrades within the system. So when you're logged into the customer support portal, you've got a few different options. You can raise support tickets where you've got a problem or a question about the system, and that'll come through to our support team. But you also have the knowledge base, and that includes all of the updates and upgrades that are available for Vernon. It'll have a sequential list of all the upgrades that have been available. If I go into one of these versions, it has the full instructions for how you apply it, plus the options to download the upgrade itself, and the documents about what's changed in that version. So if I look at this as a typical version, it's got those attachments at the end. I could click on what's new. It downloads the PDF file, and we'd be able to see a full document showing what's changed in that particular release. So that's really useful to review before you apply an upgrade to see whether there's anything you want to share with your wider group of users and whether there's any impact on any processes that you do, and also to be aware of any new features that may be of use to you. I'm now going to look at some other sundry cleanup options we've got within the system. So I'll swap back to Vernon CMS. The next thing I wanted to look at was updating indexes. So whenever you save a record, you've got the raw data you've entered, things like in this example, a brief description. Vernon then takes that information and it makes a search index of that content. So for example, in a text field, it looks at that data and it breaks it down into individual words so that you can search at word level, use wildcard searches and so on. That's not happening in real time. When you save the record, it posts that to an update queue, and in the background, Vernon's keeping up with those updates. And so we can look at that through the Tools menu under Update Indexes. The Monitor button will show what index updates are currently outstanding. So this isn't something you would normally need to look at, but if you are having problems finding records which you're sure are there, this is one way that you can check whether there's pending updates that for some reason aren't being processed in the system. So if I click on Monitor, it's telling me that there's no updates left to do for the object and person file. The start and end will tell us the number of records currently in the queue. And then for the last entry is transactions between linking records. So at the moment, there's 13 linking records that are still waiting to be updated. So as I said, you might not often need to go into here, but it's the kind of thing where we would direct you here through a support ticket. If you were having problems with indexing, we might get you to come into here and you can click on update to force all of the pending updates to go through immediately, in which case you'll just see them processing on your screen rather than happening in the background when Vernon has time to catch up with those. Or if there's some kind of problem in the database, it's possible to rebuild those search indexes. That can take a considerable amount of time because it's going back to the original raw record for every single record in that file, every object catalog record, for example, and then it's recreating those search indexes. But that's just simply by selecting the file where that particular problem search index is, then selecting the field. So if you had, for instance, problems with searching on brief description, and then we can add that field and we can mark to do a rebuild. Those rebuilds can only be done when everybody's out of the system so that records aren't being actively changed at the same time that Vernon's trying to build the entire file search index for that particular field. So as I noted, that's something more likely to come up through a support ticket, and we can guide you through that if there is an issue with searching within your system. The next thing I wanted to look at is clearing lists within the system. Whenever you do a search, Vernon is automatically saving a list of the results that you've found in the background, and it needs to do that so that within things like the data entry screen, it knows what records are in your set of results and can move forward and back through those. So an example would be if I had done a search on all of the things that are object type vars. It's found 15 of those. I haven't deliberately saved that as a list, but the system does have a list of those in the background so that you can go forward and back through those. Within the system, we don't have an easy way to know when that automatically saved list is obsolete. And so over time, those system created lists do build up in the system. And like the audit log, that's taking up a little bit of space in the system and slowing the system down a little bit in some areas. So as a supervisor, you can go in and clear those system saved lists at any point. And that's just done through List Manager. So in List Manager, there's an option under File to delete system lists. So depending on how active your users are with doing searches within the system, that might be something that you do once a month or even less frequently if it's a smaller site. So I click on that, it goes through and finds all of those temporary lists. And it just goes through looking for any lists that are older than a day. So it should have no effect on people using the system unless somebody's left Vernon running for days with a set of search results on the screen, in which case they won't be able to go forward and back through that list because that temporary list doesn't exist anymore. Now, there are a couple of other system maintenance things that I was going to show to look at how we can review the data in the system and see whether there's perhaps poor quality data that could be cleaned up in some way. So one of the common examples is that images can get moved or renamed or deleted over time. And so the system does have tools for checking for that. It's something that's done through the command line of Vernon. And that's accessible under Tools, System Maintenance, System Monitor. Now there's a help topic that describes looking for these broken image links. And I've just got that open up in the web browser, so I'll swap over to that. And that describes those command level options that Vernon has for checking the integrity of your image file links. So it's going through each of the different photo AV records and seeing whether all of those image files are still accessible. And if they're not, it gives you a report of any ones that are broken and you can decide how to address those. An example scenario is that somebody might have renamed an image folder, in which case you could use Vernon's text find and replace tool to bulk fix all of those by just replacing the folder name in the digital file name field for all of the affected records. So I'll just run the first example of that where I'm looking for all of the broken AV records. So all of the audio-visual records that link to files that no longer exist. And so that was the command run AV fix, checking for broken AV records. And so that's found around 20 image links which are no longer accessible. And I could now use that report to then go back into Windows and File Explorer and look for those files and try and understand why they're no longer available. And it may be because they've been genuinely deleted, but hopefully they've just been moved and you can then tidy up those links in Vernon. In some cases, those images really are gone and they need to be tidied up. Maybe somebody's taken new improved images and that's what's actually linked to the object records now. So that command line tool also has options for tidying up the links on the actual object records. And all of that's explained in that solutions article. The next thing I wanted to look at is analyzing the use of fields within the system. So you can look for fields that have been used very infrequently, which may indicate that they're fields that you shouldn't normally be using in your cataloging standard and you want to tidy up that data and maybe move it somewhere else. And so you can do that through the Tools menu, under Utilities, Field Usage Count. So I could do a field usage count on the object file, and I'll run that and just send it to the screen. So that'll just list all of the fields that have data and it'll show me a count of how many records are using that field. So we can see in some cases there are occasional fields that have been almost never used. So for instance, production period's only been used 2 times in the whole collection. You could decide to then review those records by searching on production period and then consider whether that's the best place for that information to be recorded. It may well be, but it may be a case where a particular user has put information where you've actually got somewhere else where you would usually record that to try and maintain consistency within the collection. In a similar way, we can also look at the terms that have been used in a field and understand whether those terms have been used infrequently and possibly could be replaced with something else. So on this catalogue record, I've got an object type. I might wish to review those object types and see whether there's any of them that have been used infrequently or not at all, and then tidy up the object type file based on that. And so I can do that through the Tools menu. And that's under Authority Tool, Term Report Replace. I need to put in the file that I'm wanting to review, which in this case is the object type file. And we need to say where we're wanting to look. So we're just wanting to check the object links there. So in the object file, it's in this field. You can choose whether you're only interested in terms that are currently in use, but I'm actually going to change that and say I want used and unused terms for the entire file. And I just want a summary, in which case it'll give me a count of how many times those terms have been used, rather than showing me one by one every object that refers to them, which could be a huge report. So if I click on Report Now, these are the terms that are in use at the moment. And we can, for example, see that there's only one single record in our entire collection that's been marked as specimen. So we could decide, well, based on that, that's not very consistent use. You might decide then to either bulk update a whole set of natural history specimens so that they all consistently say specimen, or you might decide, well, that term's too specific, we don't actually need it. And so that tool's a good way to review how commonly different terms have been used, and also see whether there's perhaps synonyms that could be merged together. So we could do a similar report on location. So I could say that I'm wanting to decide whether there's some location terms that have been infrequently used, maybe because there are genuine duplicates with similar names. And so the authority file I'm wanting to look at is location. And again, I could say that I'm wanting to look at terms regardless of whether they've been used or not. And there's many, many different places in the system where the location field is used, but you could limit that. We could say we're only interested in perhaps use of this in the location history or the current location. Again, I'll just do a summary report so I get a count of those uses. And then when I run that report, I'll be able to see which terms have been used infrequently. So there's one term, rack number 4 exists as a location, but it's never ever been used. And it's possible that rack doesn't physically exist in the storeroom anymore, and you could consider removing that. So let's take that as an example about deleting or removing those entries. So we know that rack 4 hasn't been used in the locations of the objects. And so you can delete a specific term from the database menu by going to that particular file. There's shortcuts for lots of the more detailed, complex files in the system, or you can use other files to get to any file in the system. And in this case, we're looking at location. The term we were interested in was rack number 4, so I could just do a search for rack number 4. And from the file menu, I can delete. However, we want to be sure that that particular term isn't used anywhere in the system. So the system will check whether this record has been used in any way. So firstly, it's warning me that this record's related to other records. In this case, it's related to art storeroom because it's a category underneath that. If this term really isn't used by any objects, then we'd be happy to remove that, even though it was formerly a term underneath art storeroom. That relationship would be okay to remove. But we would want to check for certain that this location hasn't been used anywhere in the system. So that report that I ran before was just on objects, but it doesn't preclude that a transport record, for instance, had been created marking that rack 4 was involved in a movement. So if I run this option, it'll go through and it'll check everywhere in the system that references locations just to be doubly sure that it's not used. And this one really isn't used, so I could, based on that, go ahead and do the delete. If it is in use, that's more complex. What you would normally do then is replace that term with some other term or mark it as do not use so that it's still available in things like location history, but can't be referenced in the future. If I just bring up one of the 3 other racks that I have. If rack 1 isn't currently referenced in any current location for an object because it doesn't exist anymore, you may still want to retain it because it's in the location history for objects in the past. And so we can do that through the location screen on the left and by going into authority management. So every single term in every authority file, whether it's an object type or a department or a location, has the option for you to say that that term is not usable from now on. Or optionally, you can allow people to still search on that. So you could find objects that were in rack number 1 once upon a time. And then we'd save that record and we would no longer be able to use that in cataloging, but we could search for references to it. So as well as retaining the term, the one other option would be to get rid of it, but to replace it with some other synonym that meant the same thing. And that's done through that same authority tool we did before. But instead of just reporting on a term, we would use the right-hand side of the screen to replace one instance with another. So if we decided that we had 2 different terms for specimen that meant similar things, we would say, what was the term that we're wanting to replace? And then we would use the right-hand side of the screen to say what we're replacing it with. So if we had another term that was called natural history specimen, might have been the other alternative term, we would enter that on the right, and then we would tell the system to do a replacement everywhere where that's mentioned. You're also welcome to send us direct messages by email or as tickets through the support portal if there's any things that you've seen today where you want to think about how you can use that within your own system or how it might address some problem that you've currently got.